Hello, everyone. I'm sorry to interrupt living in the material world, which I would never otherwise do, by Madonna. But here we are for the final session today at the pub, Politics at Sam and Anne's, a special edition to take stock of everything that we've been following today on this first day of Conservative Party conference, and also to remind you of this great podcast, which we hope is part of your daily routine. Sam and Anne, unusually in the afternoons, usually we're more frequently around looking very way-faced at about 6:30 in the morning when we record to give you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics. What a luxury it is, Sam, to be recording in the afternoon with beers and whatever we've got in front of us. But what we thought we'd do is give you a bit of insight into what we've been thinking about this first day here at the conference, but also to set us up for the week on the podcast and beyond about the challenge that we all know lurks in the air for Kemi Badenoch, for the Conservative Party. You've heard from my colleagues there in the big picture from Dan and Jonathan Martin about what they made of it, but what we're actually finding out by being here and by talking to people who make the mood music and perhaps provide some of the challenges. Sam, you rushed in looking a bit pink, which always makes me think, oh no, he's got a story.
Very nice to see you all. Thank you for joining Politics at Sam and Anne Lives. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to be with Anne in person because we stare at each other at an unholy hour of the morning, Monday to Thursday. So it's really nice to be in person here. One of the great joys of conference is the unpredictable. And Anne's right. I was just rushing over from our stand because one of the big questions hanging over this conference is, can the Tory party survive the onslaught from Reform UK and from Nigel Farage? And so for one of the big points that Kemi Badenoch wants to land this week is, we're not going to do a deal. We're not going to have a pact. I'm going to take the Tory party back to where it needs to be by the time of the next election. But the question is, and we'll go more into this tomorrow, does everyone agree? And in pursuit of finding out the answer to that question, I just managed to collar Robert Jenrick. He's the Shadow Justice Secretary, which is probably the least interesting of the various monikers that you could give him. He also was the leadership challenger last time round, and some believe he could be the leadership challenger next time round. And I asked him this question. So, Robert, do you think that Reform UK and the Tories need to fight for every vote at the next election? Or do you think that there might be some kind of pact or arrangement or understanding that could be come to avoid the two parties on the right duking it out? This is possibly the most important question that the Tories are facing. And his answer was fascinating. And at just after 6 o'clock, we'll play this clip out on Sky News. So actually the people in this Politico pub are getting it first. What he said was, Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage have been very clear there will be no pact. So I was like, hang on, what about you? And then he goes on to say, well, I think there is not going to be a deal. The approach is the right one. I'm like, hang on. And he says, I don't think a pact is the priority. And
That's interesting.
That was, I have to say, two quizzical eyebrows shot up, because this is a figure that some people say might end up going for the leadership one more time if Kemi Badenoch doesn't make it through to the end of this parliament. And his pose in relation to reform is likely to be very different, it would seem to me, so we are told, although he largely denies it, from Kemi Badenoch. So just a little bit of wiggle room there from somebody who is playing a central role, often not articulated at this conference.
The grounds are such a fascinating insight because we've heard a lot of, and a microphone as well, no expense was spared. We've had a lot of different stories about why there shouldn't be some sort of accommodation with reform. So it's interesting that the choice of words there, which was slightly along, well, it's not a priority. Of all the answers that go, this is the best leader we've got, that's what it's sort of getting my batty hearing there. Well, I put that to Kemi Badenoch, Sam, and we discussed it on the podcast on Thursday, the last one proper before we came here. Actually, we did another one opening today, but the last one before Kemi arrived, in which I asked her that as well. I mean, you've got, she said it was a distressed asset, this party. If it's a distressed asset, well, why not?
Brilliant quote. Brilliant get that into me. Brilliant quote.
Thank you, Kemi Badenoch, for saying it, really. But why not then have some sort of accommodation, right? If you're weak, if you're a company, that's why companies often look for mergers. So she then sort of said, oh, we're too far apart on policy. But the way that the weekend, I don't know what you think about this, but the way the weekend has played out so far, we've seen a closening of policy, talking about ICE, talking about how to quickly make your effectively your deportations more rigorous, more targeted. Asylum and immigration, absolute Farage territory. Climate change, we're not going to be part of the Climate Change Act anymore, absolute Farage territory. So I think where you're putting your finger on the pain point is that the reasons people think that there shouldn't be an accommodation are actually very different. Priti Patel, just here in the pub with us, so she gave rather spirited advice, saying, nah, we don't have to do this, we can do it our own way. But they are three rather different explanations of why you're not doing something which some people, I'm sure your last interviewee there, probably thinks is, going to happen.
You have to marvel at Anne, actually, because Kemi Badenoch gives her one of the big interviews before party conference season, and then goes and compares the Tory party to a distressed asset. Now, she's making the argument that you don't get quarterly returns anywhere near where you would like, but investors can see the long-term future. So she thinks that's a great metaphor to give our Anne. But I'm sitting there scratching my head, because what happens to a distressed asset? Well, often it ends up being flogged off at knockdown price to some geezer who comes along from somewhere else. So it's not a great metaphor. Anyway, for me, that phrase has underlined the start, like really has defined the start of this conference for me, because what is the purpose of the Conservative Party in an environment where they're on 16% in the polls, where the latest YouGov MRP puts the number of MPs they would get if there was an election tomorrow, there isn't, but if there were, at about 34, 35, and Kemi Badenoch is rejecting any kind of merger or pact or arrangement while taking the party's policy position closer to that of Nigel Farage's policy. Where is that articulation that we heard from Keir Starmer last week? And in that environment, how able is she to talk about distinctiveness and bluntly carve out a role for the Conservative parties that people think is credible? At this conference, Anne, it is quite clear the discussions in the bars and the restaurants and the pubs, like this one, is about her future. Right now, how would you sum it up?
Well, if you went into Labour conference, as we both did, we were making podcasts and doing reporting, which was the sort of Save Our Keir conference for people who wanted to. Andy Burnham, who perhaps arrived with different hopes and left with them unfulfilled. Hello, Andy, Manchester. I think this one is Kemi Badenoch really trying to save herself without much sense of who is really backing that. Yes, there was a lot of very, and I think genuinely from Priti Patel, who knows what it's like to be in a tight spot, having been Home Secretary, being in a lot of pressure when Boris Johnson, whom she was very loyal to then, was in charge. But what I think you'd feel it's maybe a bit different, and I've never actually asked you this, so I don't know whether you see it the same way, is that you felt there was a sort of team Keir. It was vociferous, it's all sorts of difficulties, but broadly speaking, wants to keep Keir Starmer on board. For Kemi Badenoch, I think the week is about, does that exist for her as well as for him? Because if you end up, it's one thing to fight for survival if you have a really tricky spot to be in, but you have some people behind you who really want you to stay because they do not want the other guy or the other woman because they think they stand for something absolutely terrible. They don't want their party going that way. It's a very lonely job to fight for it if people are saying, well, I'm kind of here to be loyal, but I'm checking my watch the whole time. And I think that if she left, people say, can she save the Tory party in 4 days? No, she really, really can't. But she could put herself credibly in a position where she goes forward as the leader and then is able to roll out these new ideas and these shifts, which I think are in one direction only, but she would say they're a good place to put the Tory party in. Who can she take with her?
I mean, that's a great question, because there are just so many pinch points in the months ahead. We had a list on the podcast this morning. Working backwards, you've got May next year, where if the Tories aren't really advancing, there'll be pretty brutal questions, I suspect. There's actually the budget. I think the budget on the 26th of November where this country has to grapple with tax rises in the order of 25 to 30 billion pounds, is a massive moment. But the question then is the Conservative leader articulating what the country is feeling at that moment successfully, in what will no doubt be a welter of pain and difficulty? And then the third pinch point is the pinch point that comes on November the 2nd, 2025. So a little over 6 weeks or so. Little over, around a month rather. And that's the moment where Kemi celebrates her 1 year anniversary as leader. But it's not that much of a celebration, because the 1 year protection from having 40 odd letters going into the chairman of the 22 triggering a vote of no confidence automatically expires. So you've got the who that you were just talking about, but you've also got the what, and there are a lot of bars to clear.
You brought in a scoop about a defection, which was interesting because it's a senior donor. You might just tell us a bit more about that in a moment. But also what struck me was Kemi Badenoch. I know this, a lot of people were saying to her over the summer, what are you doing? You're not out there enough. You're not on the front foot enough. We're saying to people, look, you've got to understand what I'm trying to do here. If I don't bring in the donors, if I don't keep donors, the whole thing falls apart. She had a little bit of an uptick in June, and she had been able to keep on board with great JCB out there, which would indicate Lord Bamford, the Bamford industrial leader of that family, is still on board, although he does actually also pop up at Reform Conference. So I think we're seeing quite a lot of donors and what we would once have called Tory business influential class. They're kind of dancing with two partners, aren't they? They're often in two places at once. So the idea of, are you a Tory donor? Well, it's like Schrodinger's donor might be somewhere else next week, giving money. But I think one thing that you can tell us a bit about your story, Sam, but what it said to me was, one, that the guy was also quite formative in, useful to have around to bounce strategy off. So you don't just lose the money, you lose people to talk to. Sometimes I feel when you go into the leader of the opposition's offices when things are this low, it can just feel like a quite lonely place. There's just people are not queuing up to come in. I'm not saying that utterly have to make up the time by doing interviews with journalists, but you do sometimes feel that this is not a world in which there is now enough sort of sounding board and ideas. So you get a kind of ratchet effect of one idea, and that is simply to chart reform.
Let me tell you a little story about the story behind the revelation this morning that you had on the podcast, if you've heard it. There is a veteran of the public affairs and PR industry. He's called Mark Gallagher. And back in October last year, when everybody was racing to become leader of the Conservative Party, he backed Kemi Badenoch. And he backed Kemi Badenoch with his checkbook. And he gave £2,000 to her leadership. He also did quite a lot more than that. He also sort of privately advised her and was, giving quite a lot of personal help to her. So I think it's not an inconsiderable fact that one of her earliest backers, financial and practical, has ended up going and doing the same for Nigel Farage. About 2 months ago, he gave up on the Tory party and has now gone to there. Now, reforms say that Nigel and Mark are close and they've been friends for a long time. And it's just a fact that, yes, Mark has hopped around various political parties at different points. He was a member of the Brexit Party, hasn't been a member of the Tory party since 2020. But here we have somebody who was backing Kemi a year ago, who is now backing her principal rival 1 year on. Now, here's the wrinkle, and here's the bit that actually really sort of I was interested in. One of the reasons why he's gone, I think he thinks that the country needs stronger medicine than the Tories. But one of the other reasons I was told was he just got frustrated with her. Those messages that would go off into the ether and wouldn't be replied. And I think you'll find a few people around Westminster and Manchester who've had that experience with Kemi as well. So I asked Team Kemi what they thought of this claim that maybe she wasn't stroking donors' egos enough and doing enough to sort of to keep him happy. And I got this response, and this response is for publication/broadcast.
Well, it is now.
It is. Well, to be fair to me, it.
To be fair to me,
it was
me being fair to me. One of the great journalist quotes.
It began with an aide said. So this aide said, who works for Kemi Badenoch, she gets 20 texts every minute from MPs, friends, ex-MPs, supporters, peers, people offering advice and so on. She endeavours to get back to everyone, but realistically, she's running the world's oldest political party, doing media interviews, having meetings, doing visits, and being a wife and mother of 3 young children. So it would be quite churlish to get quite so upset about timely responses. And I just thought, my goodness, we're 10 minutes before the formal start of the Blinken Party conference, and we're already at kind of like, DEFCON, whatever it is, DEFCON 6. And the truth is that clearly triggered them, and you don't often get an angry response like that for publication. Sometimes you get it in the neck, but you don't often get it deliberately to be put out. And I think that tells us a couple of things. I think we've struck a nerve. I think it tells you about the atmosphere in the office, if I'm being honest. And I think it tells you about the sensitivity around some of these questions to do with her. What do you think?
I do think that, and just to put it in a bigger, because sometimes we can kind of get quite into sort of detail, and we need to be in the detail of politics. One thing I really enjoyed about the session previous, I mean, you were running around trying to put an electronic tag on Robert Jenrick, so I don't think you heard it. Robert Jenrick, please can I go somewhere, so like a nail bar or something? But I was listening to my colleague Jonathan Martin talking with Dan Bloom about, what has happened really on the right of politics, and bringing that transatlantic prism to it, which we like to do at Politico, to kind of join the dots between the big shifts that are happening. And one of the things that they ended up discussing, Jonathan Marston sort of brought into the discussion, was, look, if you have Republican politics in America effectively taken over by Donald Trump, by MAGA, and basically by a force, whether we like it or not, is dominant in reshaping transatlantic politics, well, you don't kind of need a reform party. You don't need these other parties or these spats that you guys are all talking about. He was thinking, he was listening to Priti Patel saying, no, we are still conservatives. We have a distinctive message of our own. She was obviously pushing back when I said that most things I thought were just leading towards a narcissism of small difference with reform. She said not. But it was, as Jonathan Martin pointed out, and he and Dan then went on to discuss, if there's a big push to own the politics of identity, oddly enough, often on the right, many people say they don't like identity politics, but they've driven a wedge between identity and the economic argument, where the left tended to say this is all about the economy, and if we just look after people better, redistribute better, sort out their economic well-being, they won't, putting it in inverted commas, go so crazy, vote for parties further to the right. It's interesting that Jonathan sort of saw this, well, no wonder you've got this problem, because either you let, the big guy take over the political movement, which I'm afraid right now would be Nigel Farage if you're a Conservative, or you're in an unwinnable battle. And it's a bit like, well, take it from me, because I've just watched this play out in the US. That was an intriguing way to look at it.
No, that's fascinating. And it all comes down to whether or not big picture promises can be made. Now, the Tory argument, I think actually listening to Kemi's speech on the stage today is quite instructive in exactly this debate. Kemi's point to everybody in the hall was, yes, you might think that there are similarities between the way I do politics and some of the policy announcements that I do and the announcements that are coming from Nigel Farage. But make no mistake, the difference between us is that when I say it, I've done the work, and when he says it, he hasn't done the work. Now,
yeah, what did you make of that? It's like we will be more efficient and effective at being Nigel Farage and Nigel Farage.
I can see a number of complications with that. I work harder than you. Do the British? My first question: do the British public actually respect the people who work the hardest? Sometimes I wonder. There is a curiosity that Theresa May, who did the boxes all night, or Rishi Sunak, who was the hardest work. That isn't ultimately something that is automatically something that is a vote winner in British politics. The next thing is, I think some people would think, well, isn't the civil service the place where, bluntly, the vast reams of detail are gone through, and the idea is put and turned into made flesh. So, is the Conservative Party alighting on the problems that people want to hear and do the solutions sound credible? And in a world where they sound similar, it's not automatically the hardest worker who wins. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of Pepsi Coca-Cola taste test, isn't it? For some people who are really interested in Pepsi versus Coca-Cola, it's really fascinating. They've got a strong view on it. If not, it's just like quite nice cold brown stuff in a glass. So I think there is that, and I mean this efficiency. I think let's just try to do an in fairness moment, which sometimes do step back on the podcast when we're in danger of becoming quite airy.
Anne's good at those. I'm not.
I am the in fairness. In fairness has sort of become my middle name on the podcast. Let's look at the position that realistically that the party is in going into this conference. The polls are what they are. They're not going to change miraculously. We had Priti Patel, and I thought she was being about for a former Home Secretary who was in post when the big immigration wave happened. She was pretty candid in saying, yes, we have to face up to the Boris wave. So even, didn't recoil when I used a phrase which is basically used, to troll them by Farage. There's certain things, we have no more control over. We have to accept, the public will have a certain view on, and then we have to redefine ourselves in some way that is appealing, put in a nutshell. One argument that I think we will see play out, I think Mel Stride will raise it, I think Kemi Badenoch intended to raise it, and then the dreadful Manchester attacks happened. And she then changed the top of her speech, naturally enough, and I thought her tone was actually very, very solid, very sombre on that we can't just let this moment go and say that was a rather unfortunate, horrible thing that happened in Manchester, and no, let's crack on with our conference, that she felt that there was still, an argument to be had with Labour about the policing of both hate speech, hate marches, etc. So I think with this argument about we are the more economically grown-up party and that reform has a weak flank on that is still to come. I think we will hear it. I think we'll hear it from Shadow Business Secretary, I think is on stage with us here tomorrow, and from Mel Stride. The question is, can you make space for that economic argument? We Conservatives, and I'm not even, doing this sort of, what about Liz Truss? Because most of them are like, we wouldn't have done it that way. Only Liz Truss would have done it that way. But even if you let them have the space to make the argument, do we feel, Sam, that is something that could cut through? Because there must be some weak flank to reform. It's not unreasonable for the Conservatives to try to find it on something where, if not recently, then historically, they've been seen as a party of the economy. Could they get back there?
Misa, I've got an answer. But before I give the answer, we will take questions if anyone wants to ask us anything about the podcast, Tories, what we saw last week at the Labour conference. What is the weak flank of Reform UK? It's Nigel Farage, for this reason. If Nigel Farage is detached from Reform UK, I think the whirligig of British politics spins again. I think that if Reform UK go into the next election without Nigel Farage, I have no idea how it will do. I think that every party at that point has a fighting chance of being, the biggest party in British politics in a way that, we've no idea how it's going to shake down at the moment. So there is a confluence of interest between the Tories, the Lib Dems and the Greens and the Labour Party to in some way detach Nigel Farage from his party. And there are huge gains for all of the established parties if he is able, and they are able to do that. So, my question is, why aren't they all trying harder?
Isn't that like saying if Freddie Mercury had not been in Queen wouldn't have been so good?
Yeah, what's wrong with that?
Because it's hard to detach him from the project of success.
But if there is some kind of scandal that attaches him, that means that he is too toxic. If there is some kind of reason, a falling out at the top, if you sow division between all of those high-profile, high-octane, high-energy individuals, such that there is a falling out, could that be to the benefit of anybody else? My essay question is, has Nigel Farage ever fallen out with anyone before?
He can see success in his sights. Anyway, to be continued, doubtless for the next 3 years on the podcast. But we should hear some thoughts and challenges and ideas from you guys.
Any questions?
Hello, fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm going to do a bit of crystal ball gazing, if I may. Isn't the challenge facing all the political parties over the next remainder of the Parliament actually the bond crisis that's coming? So the Western governments in Europe, France in particular, have got challenges with its sovereign debt. And we see that coming, unfortunately, in the United Kingdom. And shouldn't actually governments, parties in the UK be planning for what is, in my view, almost inevitably going to come over the next 2 to 3 years?
I think it's right if I just dive in on that one. I think you're absolutely right. So I think the great underweighted aspect that could really change the political dynamic, both here in the UK, where our focus is, but across Europe, is the fact that there is an inherent instability there in the bond markets. We don't really know whether a course correction, which people have been saying coming in the US, is going to be as dramatic as skeptics of what Donald Trump has been doing and his inflationary effects are great. We do know that there is a potential instability there, and you can see it in the French economy, with the debt to GDP ratio at 112. When we were in the negative Eurovision Song Contest on that, coming in at 96, and even that is bad enough. I think you're onto something that we don't just genuinely do not know the answer to. Is there a sort of, without even the scale of a great financial crisis, is there a GFC type event that changes the way that all the parties, as Sam was right to point out that there was perhaps a weak flank there on reform? The Tories are, I think, hoping that if something happens that is economically a disaster across the piece, that they